starting to make your presentations here, it's very important to figure out how to present this data to the public. And so a lot of different approaches, visual approaches have been tried. This summer in the lab, we are actually training high school students in actual computer programming in how to actually write our own software to gather this data and to analyze it. We happen to be using, this is from a programming language called Perl. We're using another one called Python. All of these things are freely available as part of the open source software movement. So you don't have to invest anything into doing this. But as I said, making graphical representations so other people can understand what you're doing is also a very important part of this. So I want to talk about some of the specific projects that we've worked on recently and how we're actually trying to answer questions about human history and primate history by, again, figuring out how their genomes vary within themselves and between each other. Here we see a recent project that one of my grad students, who's also now a postdoctoral researcher at Yale, carried out, in which we looked at people in Southeast Asia, particularly some of the hill tribes in Thailand and in that region, amongst them the Karen, the Hmong, and some others, and looked at their genotypes and tried to figure out their history. How long ago did they migrate into this region? From where did they come, and so on. And we've had several publications come out of this so far. We have also been trying to figure out, the fossil record is a very, very important tool, obviously, for evolutionary biologists. But we don't always have a complete fossil record. We don't know necessarily when certain lineages appeared and where they appeared. But it turns out, using molecular data, using DNA data, we can actually infer when different lineages of organisms split from each other using a concept called the molecular clock. As DNA molecules slowly mutate over time, they're much like radioactive substances decaying. And by counting up the number of mutations and knowing their mutation rate, much like knowing the half-life of an isotope, we can actually figure out how long ago they came into, the two different groups came into being. And depending on their distribution, and maybe some fossils, we might be able to figure out where they came from. So one of our analyses, we actually determined that, or we've inferred, and we've been testing it ever since, that the ancestor of humans, chimps, and gorillas actually came from Eurasia and not from Africa. And this was a rather surprising finding. But it turns out, if we look at the fossil record and the geological record, our scenario that around 20 million years ago, an ancient ape species migrated out of Africa into Eurasia, ultimately giving rise to the orangutans and gibbons and other Asian apes. But around 10 million years ago, one species of that ancient radiation migrated back into Africa, ultimately giving rise to gorillas, chimpanzees, and then humans. And so we needed this molecular evidence to work this out. The geological record fit. Africa and Asia haven't always been in contact with each other, but there was a period around 20 million years ago when they were. They were then split by what was called the Tethys Sea, the giant Mediterranean Sea at the time. And it wasn't until about 10 million years later that these continents finally collided back together for their last time. And we hypothesize that's when one of these ape-like creatures, here we see a fossil that's commonly found in Turkey and Greece, that looks remarkably similar to many of the features that we find in chimpanzees and gorillas, which look rather similar to our common ancestor with them. But this would mean that the orangutan is an incredibly distant relative. And although my colleague Jeff Schwartz at the University of Pittsburgh has been trying to propose that the orangutan is the human's closest relative, he's been unfortunately ignoring the vast amount of DNA data. And recently he published a paper in which I was interviewed about the DNA evidence for this, and I want to come back to this right towards the end of my talk, because there'll be a TV show coming up next week in which I talk about this. We've also examined monkeys found in Central and South America, in which we've had sort of debates with colleagues, with paleontologists, over different fossils. Are they related to particular living species today, or are they long extinct side branches of evolution? And we've been able to actually sort of answer this question using molecular data. And it turns out, in the New World, in Central and South America, while monkeys arrived here very early, around 30 million years ago or so, from Africa, and they diverged into a wide number of different species, all but one of those species went extinct. And it wasn't until around 20 million years ago a single species then gave rise to an entire another radiation of these monkeys. So the molecular data, by using the molecular clock, we were able to answer this question. Do these monkeys have 30 million year ancient histories like we see proposed here, or are they much more recent, and this fact only 20 million years ago? We've been applying this same logic to many other groups, and that is going to allow us, again, to get at some of the important questions revolving around diseases such as AIDS and malaria. So here is one of my former graduate students. He's now the head of the Wildlife Conservation Society's entire operation in the Congo in Central Africa. Here's a photo I took. We're only a couple kilometers from the equator. And these young boys on the side of the road are selling bananas and a dead monkey that their father has shot to people driving down the street who will buy this, just like you might buy a hot dog off a cart there, and turn this into the evening meal. The problem is these monkeys naturally have been infected with a virus called SIV, simian immunodeficiency virus. It turns out this is, in fact, almost identical to HIV. And if we would start naming this all over again, we would never have HIV, because HIV, the human immunodeficiency virus, is merely an ape and monkey virus that we have caught by interacting with these animals, mostly through what's known as the bushmeat market here. The killing and butchering of these animals has caused people to be infected. And we know this because by working out the evolutionary history of these African monkeys and apes, and the evolutionary history of the different strains of the virus, we can see that this virus has crossed